In this video, we're going to talk about catecholamine synthesis. This is really important because that's how we make our neurotransmitters, dopamine, norepinephrine. It's also how we make the hormone epinephrine. And let's start with getting to dopamine. So in the midbrain, we have a couple of clusters of neurons, or nuclei. One is called the substantia nigra, leads to the nigrostriatal pathway with movement. The other is the ventral tegmental area, and it leads to the nucleus accumbens and the mesolimbic pathway, reward pathway. So both of these clusters of neurons will make dopamine, and when that dopamine is released, it has its effect as a neurotransmitter. So let's see what happens. If we follow these dopaminergic neurons to where they're released, the axon goes down and you have the axon terminal, and that's where all this synthesis happens. So tyrosine comes from outside the cell, and there's a tyrosine transporter that will allow it into the axon terminal. And this is what tyrosine looks like. It's an amino acid, has an amino group, an acid group. We have this in zwitterion form. It also has a hydrogen and then the R group. And the R group is what makes each amino acid different. This one has a methylene group, a benzene ring with a hydroxyl group. So this is tyrosine, and this is where it starts. So tyrosine moves in to the axon terminal, and there's enzymes in the axon terminal called tyrosine hydroxylase. And what it'll do is it'll add a hydroxyl group, to this benzene. And now this is our catechol ring, and that's why we call them catecholamines, because it has a catechol ring. And we'll see why it's called catecholamine in a minute. So now we have a different molecule. This is called L-DOPA. It's the precursor to dopamine. And L-DOPA stands for just L for what side it's on, L and D. But the DOPA stands for dihydroxyphenylalanine. So if we were to take both of these hydroxyl groups off, that amino acid is called phenylalanine. If we add two hydroxyl groups to it, it's called dihydroxyphenylalanine, and that's DOPA. That's the precursor to dopamine. That happens out here in the cytoplasm. And then we have another enzyme called dopa decarboxylase. And what dopa decarboxylase does is it decarboxylates. It takes the carboxyl group off here and just puts a hydrogen there. So now this molecule is dopamine, and that's the one that it'll actually move into the vesicle through a VMAT, vesicular monoamine transporter. So anytime you have a molecule that has the amino group but doesn't have the acid group, you can call it, if it's an amino acid that has the acid group removed, you can call that a monoamine. So it's called vesicular monoamine transferase. That's going to move dopamine into the vesicle. And if we're in these dopaminergic neurons that come from the midbrain, that's where it ends. That's where it stops. And whenever an action potential comes in, the calcium will go into the axon terminal and cause the exocytosis to ensue from that point. All right, so let's say that we're at a postganglionic neuron, a sympathetic postganglionic neuron. And at this point, you can take it a step further within the vesicle itself. There's actually an enzyme in the vesicle, and it's called dopamine beta hydroxylase. And so all it's doing is it's on this carbon here, it adds an oxygen to make this an alcohol group. And so it takes dopamine and hydroxylates the dopamine, and that makes norepinephrine. So we go to a completely different neurotransmitter that has a completely different function at this point. And then if we're at a sympathetic ganglion, that's where it ends. And whenever an action potential comes in, calcium rushes in, causes the vesicle to merge with the cell membrane and release its contents. That will be the endpoint of that one. But let's say that we're in the adrenal medulla. So above the kidney, we have the adrenal gland. The outside part of the adrenal gland is called the cortex, and it secretes some hormones. And then on the inside part of the adrenal gland, it's called the adrenal medulla. And there's cells here called the chromaffin cells. And chromaffin cells have a particular enzyme in their cytoplasm. And so we have to take this norepinephrine and it leaks back out into the cytoplasm when we're inside the adrenal gland of the in the adrenal medulla. So when it leaks out in the cytoplasm in the adrenal gland, not at these sympathetic ganglions. So imagine this isn't, we're actually in a cell here in the adrenal gland. Then this norepinephrine would leak out, and then there's an enzyme there called phenylethanolamine N-methyltransferase. And what it does is it transfers a methyl group to the nitrogen. That's what's called N-methyltransferase. So it'll put a methyl group right here, and now we're to epinephrine. And then the epinephrine will move back into the vesicle through the vesicular monoamine transporter. And now, if you're in the adrenal medulla, chromaffin cells, and a preganglionic neuron comes and stimulates it, then it will release its contents into the bloodstream, and that's why it's called a hormone.